Hello, nature nerds. Welcome to Ask an Ecologist. My name is Suzanne Simpson. I'm an ecologist with Bayou Land Conservancy. I wanted to be coming to you from the outdoors today, per usual, but unfortunately, there was a lot of noisy work happening outside my back patio. So we are coming to you from indoors, but to make up for it, I decided to have Mrs. Nesbitt, the Kenyan sandboa, guest star again today for this week's episode. So I hope you'll forgive the indoor setting. And Mrs. Nesbitt is in the midst of her mating season, so quarantine is hard on everyone, folks. She's feeling it. So this week we have a few of your questions to get to, which I'm excited to do. And it is also National Invasive Species Awareness Week. So we're going to talk a bit about invasive species, give a few examples, and chat about what you can do to help promote native and healthy ecosystems. So let's get to it. Our first question comes from Elise Fleming. If you tuned into last week's episode, we talked about whether or not quarantine has been beneficial for the environment. And Elise Fleming asked if I could elaborate a little bit specifically on how quarantine has affected the environment in Houston. And to do that, I'm going to use air quality as a model. So surprisingly, even though we've had 40% less driving over the quarantine period in Houston, our air emissions haven't decreased as significantly as you might expect. And a big reason for that is that we have the highest concentration of petrochemical facilities in the country here in Houston. So while we're driving less, we're still producing and consuming a lot of energy. And the residential communities that are outside, that are far away from those petrochemical facilities, have seen some reductions in emissions. But the unfortunate flip side of that is that our most vulnerable communities and communities of color that are living by these petrochemical facilities have not seen any benefit to the air pollution reductions during quarantine. And as we all know by now, having polluted air can affect your breathing, your airway, and that can also leave you vulnerable to side effects from COVID-19. So if there's one positive that I can glean from this, and I'm not trying to put a silver lining on it, it's that our air pollution models going forward may be able to be more accurate because we now better understand the impact that vehicle emissions have on our air pollutions and what the predominant source of the air pollution in Houston is. And so a big shout out to Iris Gonzalez, who is the executive director of the Coalition for the Environment, Equity, and Resilience, for helping me out with this answer. Go and check CEER out, CEER, if you want more information on what you can do to advocate for environmental equity in the Houston area. Okay, next question. I have received many pictures of tiny little frogs hopping around people's houses. And the question is, what is this frog that is everywhere in large numbers? All the pictures that I've received have been of the Gulf Coast toadlets. Now, let's just hold on for a second and realize that toadlets is a real word, and it's, I think, one of the top 5 cutest words in the English dictionary, right next to owlets. And so toadlets are just recently morphed toads that are hopping around everywhere right now. It's late May. They've just completed their metamorphosis, and now they're out looking for food, water, and shelter, and they can hop around in really large numbers. They also may be calling in your backyard or around town. If you hear a call, especially at night after a rain, send us a recording and we will try to determine what it is that you are hearing call around your house. As you can see, Mrs. Nesbitt is very active today. She is mugging for the camera for sure. So just like the toadlets, we have some very active snakes happening. Okay, and our main topic for this week is that it is National Invasive Species Awareness Week. Now, invasive species are species that have not historically occurred in an ecosystem, and they cause damage to the ecology, the economy, or human health. And they're considered to be the second most common reason that a species will be placed on the endangered species list right after habitat loss. Now, as naturalists and scientists and practitioners, we have very limited resources with which to manage our ecosystem. So I want to give my somewhat brief take and philosophy behind invasive species management. So my background for my master's degree, I did research on the Cuban tree frog, which is an invasive anurin in Florida. And I think it's important to make the distinction between non-native invasive species and non-native non-invasive species. If the goal of your garden is to make sure that there are no non-natives in there, I think that we end up missing the point of what ecosystem management is all about. Species distribution does happen, and we humans are certainly responsible for facilitating it much more rapidly, and certainly facilitating species that wouldn't have normally increased their distribution to where they are now. But it is possible for native species to adapt to a new species in their environment. So some non-native species are responsive to competition, which is a really good quality. That means they're not going to overtake your garden or overtake your natural area. So instead, and if we focus on solely eliminating every non-native species, our science becomes inefficient and frankly a little bit jingoistic. So let's focus on the invasive non-native species that are reducing biodiversity and or reducing our ecosystem functions. And that's going to be the best use of our resources, the best use of our scientific investigation going forward. So I'll give a couple of examples of, and by the way, two examples of non-native species that have actually contributed positively on the whole to our environment is the earthworm. A lot of people don't realize the earthworm is not a native species to the United States. And also the European honeybee, which we're always talking about, especially with the murder hornet episode. So two invasive species that I want to focus on today is one, the feral hog. That's the wildlife one I'm going to focus on. And then the Chinese tallow is the vegetation that I'm going to focus on. Now, feral hogs, I could do an entire Ask an Ecologist series on the feral hogs, their introduction, their spread, and their management. I am instead going to focus on a kind of gray area about feral hog elimination and eradication that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about, but that I personally find very interesting. Feral hogs, if you're not familiar, were brought over by the settlers to A, so the settlers could have a lunch, and B, so the settlers had something fun to hunt. And domestic pigs and Eurasian wild boars have hybridized, and those domestic pigs and wild boars and those hybrids are what we know as feral hogs. They are very, very destructive to cropland. They are very destructive to wetlands, and they can even pose a danger to human safety. So it's widely considered to be the most destructive invasive species in the United States. And one way that folks will try to reduce their populations either in and around their property or in large natural areas is by trapping them. And I think if you asked a lot of outdoors people and a lot of conservationists how they felt about the complete eradication of feral hogs, surprisingly, you might encounter some mixed feelings. Because while feral hogs are really damaging and destructive, they're also really fun to hunt recreationally. And so the prospect of having feral hogs go away altogether can actually bring up some complicated feelings in people that would otherwise be very supportive of their elimination. Now, for better or worse, we are nowhere near having to reach the point to have those discussions of whether feral hogs are going to be completely eliminated as a species. In fact, we are desperately trying to slow their spread throughout the United States, certainly throughout the state of Texas. I believe they are in all counties now, even the furthest west county in Texas. So what you can do to help slow the spread is to ensure that if someone is trapping feral hogs on your property or property around you, that they actually are killing the feral hogs and not just loading them up in a truck and moving them to somewhere else where they can be hunted. That has been one of the main sources of the spread of feral hogs throughout the country. And that can really serve as a model for invasive species spread, period. A lot of it has been facilitated by human activity. It's not just that the animals are spreading themselves naturally, we're facilitating their spread. And this is perhaps the most literal and egregious example of spreading invasive species is by trapping feral hogs in one location and then moving them to another location and releasing them so that they can be hunted and sometimes commercially. So that is a little bit on the feral hog. And then we have the Chinese tallow, which is an extremely aggressive tree that loves to grow here in Houston. It can handle really wet areas and also ephemerally wet areas, so areas that are wet part of the year, but maybe not wet all the time. It's amazing the different types of habitats that this tree is able to grow in, and it does not respond well to competition, meaning it outcompetes native species, and it will overall reduce the biodiversity of a tract. Additionally, they do attract pollinators, but there is some research that suggests it may be a form of an ecological trap where it attracts pollinators, but it doesn't produce the nutrients that the pollinators need to really thrive. And so it can actually trick pollinators into coming up to it, pollinating it, but the pollinators aren't getting as much out of it as they would with other species. So what you can do to help is if you have a Chinese tallow tree in your yard, you might consider replacing it with a native species. The Texas Tree Selector by the Texas A&M Forest Service is a great tool that you can use to determine the best tree for your environment. Tallow are great at making more tallow, and so even reducing just the number of one in your yard can make a big impact on its seed distribution overall. And all we can do is control what is in our backyard sometimes. And so doing that is being a conservationist in action in your neighborhood. Also, many conservation groups in Texas and nationwide will hold invasive species work days where you can roll up your sleeves, get dirty, and kill plants in order to save nature. So you can spend a morning with a conservation group and support their efforts to increase biodiversity and create healthy, balanced ecosystems that you can access. So I think that does it for this episode of Ask an Ecologist. Thank you, Mrs. Nesbitt, for being my co-host. Remember to submit your questions by sending us a Facebook message. You can send us an email at info@bayouland.org. And I look forward to catching up with you on next week's episode of Ask an Ecologist. Thank you.